So everybody, welcome to our next episode of the Whiskey Enthusiasts Discussion with the Pros. We are actually very honored tonight to have a special guest who was recommended to us by our friend Paul Hletko. We have Margie Lehrman. And Margie is, you're I believe it's the title, Executive Director, correct? Of the
CEO, but
CEO?
executive director works.
Okay, of the American Craft Spirits Association. And although we already touched on this a little bit a minute ago, I am going to ask you this question anyway. We know that you're not at home where you would typically have your own whiskey selection. We know that you're at your mother's house all the way up in upstate New York. What are you drinking tonight and why, or is it not even something you even want to tell us about?
Well, I'll tell you about it, but big shout out to my mom who turned 91 yesterday and still lives alone. So yay, mom, go. Yay, mom. So I went into the Lazy Susan where she keeps her liquor, and there was absolutely no whiskey whatsoever. So I have to tell you, though, I'm still drinking a Members Craft Laird's.
Okay.
So I'm with Laird's tonight. So here is Bottoms Up. Hello.
Okay. Hello. Bottoms Up. Wonderful. So I am drinking tonight from our friend Paul Hletko. I'm drinking Paul's. Okay. So from Few in Evanston, I'm drinking Paul's award-winning American Straight Whiskey, which I love. Paul was one of our earlier interviewees. I've known Paul for years. And after I interviewed Paul, and then I sent out a message on Facebook asking for more suggestions of people to interview, you were one of the people whom he said that we have to talk with.
So sweet. Yes. I wonder if that's because when I was in Reykjavik last November, I went into a fantastic whiskey bar there, and there on the top shelf was a good old bottle of Few. Okay. So actually they broke it out, and there my husband and I sat, and I think we depleted about a half of that bottle.
Oh, that's hilarious. So I have a similar story. Almost exactly a year ago, I was in Israel. I was in Tel Aviv, and there's this great place that I know that Lynn and Ralph have been to. It's called Whiskey Bar and Museum. And one of the things that I was doing when I was walking around was looking for bottles where I knew people affiliated with the company. And there I saw a bottle of Few bourbon, and I took a picture of it and I posted it and I tagged Paul, so I totally get that. It's exciting when you see something stuff. Yeah, it is good. No, it's excellent stuff. So you are the representative of the trade association. And before we get into the nitty gritty, there's a question that I have to ask you, because this is something that comes up frequently. Craft, the word craft. And, with respect to your association, what is a craft spirit?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And if you go to our website, we purposely don't define it because it's our belief that craft is in the eyes and in the palate, even more importantly, of the beholder, of the person who consumes it. So what may be craft to you may not be craft to me. And while there are certain standards that we can define, and certainly in competitions, they're looking for markers, what makes one gold versus which one is a silver, but we purposely do not define craft, allowing the consumer to define it for him or herself.
Okay, and so let's talk about the consumer then. With respect to the consumer, what do you think the consumer believes a craft spirit to be?
Well, another really good question, because again, it's going to depend on what consumer you speak to. So just to back up for a little bit, when I first came to this association community in 2015, we were running spirits competitions, and the judges of that competition were predominantly you across the board. And there were very little of me, younger me, older me, and the demographics weren't there. So when we broke that up, what we realized very quickly is what I might consider craft in my palate wants and craves could be very different from what you were socialized with, what your own experience with that liquid is. So in terms of what I might look for, again, it's probably going to be very different than what you might look for.
Okay, I mean that's a fair answer because, as I think I mentioned to you beforehand, Todd Coe and I every year, we host what we call the craft whiskey table at a fundraiser. Okay, that
Okay.
we do every year, and every year prior to that, we try to come up with a list of craft spirits that we've learned about or heard about or wanted to taste, and then we go and we talk with Brett Pontani at Binny's and walk through the aisles, and every once in a while he'll look at something and he'll say, oh, no, that's not craft. And, it's just, and again, you said it's an opinion thing, and it's interesting to get a different opinion as to what it is from different people. But I understand why you don't define it. I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think to illustrate that, and it wasn't specifically a situation I want to refer to, it was a gin panel. And it was all sort of middle-aged white men that were craving maybe something from Mad Men. So when they were tasting a gin that had really heavy contemporary botanicals, and I found it so intriguing and delightful, and I was like so excited about it, I looked at the scores and thought, surely we couldn't have been tasting the same thing, and we did. So that's why we really changed who sits on the panel and make sure that even in all of our spirits competitions, it's broken up.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. So with respect to your association, what is your actual mission? Who do you represent?
Sure. So the American Craft Spirits Association was founded back in 2013 when we realized that there was not one single trade group that represented the interests of our small business craft spirits entrepreneurs that we knew were growing throughout the country. And at that point, there were a couple for-profit groups, but they're different than a trade group because when you have a trade group, that means that you are electing your board, and the board themselves is no longer beholden to their own opinion, but represents the area that they're from. So if there's a discussion in the boardroom and a vote is taken, every single one of those 15 elected board members must go out of that room in unison, even if they disagreed inside the room in terms of what that position should be. So what does that mean? It means that we are representing more clearly with a unified voice what's happening throughout the country. And I will say that as a trade group, we do everything that you would think of, what trade groups should be doing. And you asked what our mission is. It's to elevate and advocate for the community of craft spirits producers. So if you think about that, to elevate, it means in everything from, for example, when the pandemic hit, to make sure that we knew enough about how to secure a PPP loan so our small business members could take advantage of the same thing.
Oh,
When
sure,
we
that
had a
makes sense.
pivot
Yeah.
and our distillers throughout the entire country were suddenly making hand sanitizer, we were the liaison between TTB, between FDA, between EPA, between hazmat, because who would have thought to ship hand sanitizer, it's a hazmat material and you need certain certification or training in order to ship a box of hand sanitizer.
Oh, so you had to become experts on that immediately.
Very quickly, very quickly. And that's the beauty of working with a trade group. All my members in committees and the board are all volunteers, but we immediately put together a COVID-19 task force, and we hit everything from business interruption loans to hand sanitizer to just even some of the mental health issues that some distillers were having when they realized they were needing to let go of their teams.
Right, and not just let go of their teams, but they had to stop having tours. They had to stop having tastings.
Yes.
We've talked to, we've, I'm sure you saw the list of the people whom we've interviewed, but we've the Blom brothers. We talked, of course, with Bill Welter from Journeyman, and having to stop the tours when all of a sudden one employee gets tested positive. Okay, or somebody might have been exposed. I can only imagine the safety protocols that you were probably involved in helping them create, right?
Exactly. You mentioned the Blom brothers. Interestingly, last year about this very time, I was in Berlin at Bar Convent in Berlin at their show and doing a program on tasting rooms and the consumer's experience in tasting rooms. And I remember when Mike told me that over 1 million visitors come to Galena every year and busloads of people going through that tasting room. Can you imagine losing that revenue? And it's not just the one distillery, but sort of that ripple effect for the entire community then is impacted when one distillery can't pull in people like that.
Right, especially a place like that that doesn't have many tourist attractions that it would do that. Um,
Exactly.
well, believe me, we're all trying to keep the small businesses open, but that's, that would be a longer discussion for another time. So you mentioned advocacy. At any moment in time, a trade association has some very pressing legislation or regulation that they're working on. And you mentioned to me something about FET relief. Can you talk a little bit about what FET relief actually is and
Sure.
what you're working on with that right now?
Absolutely, because that has almost single-handedly consumed my time. And I mentioned earlier, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. So pre-pandemic, I was spending quite a bit of time on Capitol Hill. Now everything's done by Zoom. But the main issue that's facing craft distillers right now, and it actually falls on craft distillers more so than any other category within our alcohol beverage sector. So beer, wine, spirits, cideries, meaderies. We have the most to lose. And what am I talking about? Back in 2017, December 2017 to be specific, finally, we were able to put provisions of the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act into the president's Tax 1.0. And what it did is it took from $13.50 down to $2.70 per proof gallon, up to 100,000 proof gallons. So up to 100,000, taxes go from $13.50 down to $2.70. Wow. So that was passed for 2 years. We were able to get it extended for another year. Well, as of right now, in 2 months, 4 days, and 3 hours, unless we are able to pass some sort of extension or have this done in permanency, craft distillers will realize a 400% increase in excise taxes that must be paid. So as soon as it's removed from bond, pay the excise tax. Now, why do I say that we have more to lose than anyone else? Beer and wine will go back to either the tax refund or tax credit that they previously received. The big brands, we estimate that Diageo, for example, uses up the tax credit in a half a day. Wow. Craft distillers don't use it up in a full year. So it is incredibly important. And just Friday, I actually did a survey of our members. And right now we have well over 100 people already responded. My question to them was, if we are unable to have the tax, federal excise tax relief extended, what steps will you be taking? Will it impact your business? Well, 99% of the people responding said, yes, it will negatively impact my business. With the primary 65% as of just an hour ago, have told me that they're going to need to lay people off immediately. The month of January.
Is there anything that we can do? So in other words, after this call, if there is, if there are talking points and people whom we should call, you have my email address and you have Eric's email address because
yes.
We've been emailing. Please send me that information because we can send that out to all the people on our list. Our Facebook group has over 250 people. We also have a separate email list, and we could absolutely send something out.
Activate the troops, because truthfully, right after laying people off was lessening production, manufacturing.
Well, that's un-American, goddammit.
Well, and it also means we might be losing a foothold in terms of some of our innovation then as well, right?
Jesus. Okay. Well, that's depressing. So I have to ask you one other depressing topic before we start talking actually about whiskey. Tariffs. Let's talk a little about the tariffs.
Yeah.
That's obviously a very politicized issue, but if we can just talk about again what the tariffs mean to your members.
So in the craft spirits world, typically about only 10% of our overall population are exporting. But for some, it represented a 40% revenue stream for their overall business. When the tariffs first hit and we got slapped that horrific tariff, people's business dried up pretty quickly in that area. It went from 40, 30, some went down to 2%. Others who had actually pallets on freighters going overseas, they never even unloaded them. On the other side, they said, we don't even want these. So it's really changed sort of the business model. So this year has been particularly difficult, and it's not just for those who are manufacturing whiskey, but across the board, of course, because you mentioned the closure of tasting rooms. You couple that with the pandemic itself, which has wreaked havoc on some. You couple that then with the tariffs, and then you add on to that the uncertainty of business planning, because, and that's what I get calls from members every day, my investors want to know, and are we going to experience this 400% increase? Because some have said, does that mean we have to raise prices? Perhaps. Does it mean that we only do what we know we can sell and cut out the things that oftentimes serve as R&D for the larger brands? Perhaps. Should we not source ingredients that we thought would be so cool? Yes. Heirloom corns that have been going into some of these whiskeys, right? Well, let's cut that out. They're a little more expensive. We don't know whether that grain will work.
Right, because you mentioned innovation, so obviously, if costs are increasing and profits are going down, you have less of an ability to reinvest in the business.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So right now, we, together with the other trade groups in the Washington area, have begged actually the United States trade rep and the counterpart over in Europe to continue negotiating. This is one of those situations I think we all know. The issue is not the issue.
It's all political.
It's all political, and it deals with airplanes. And we know in Congress, oftentimes the issue is not the issue, and you kind of get caught up as pawns. And even with the federal excise tax, I didn't mention that it has garnered 75% support in the Senate and 80% in the House of Representatives. So both sides of the aisle, and it's wildly popular, and that's why we can't get it passed. Because it is so popular, they want to hold on to us to allow the other extenders to kind of have us pull the other ones along that are not popular. Go figure, right?
That is so backwards.
Yes. So if anybody on the phone on this call has ever studied politics, it doesn't quite work like that, as we well know.
No, that's it's funny you mentioned other trade groups. One of my favorite movies, and it's obviously very tongue-in-cheek. I assume that you've seen the movie Thank You for Smoking.
Yes.
I love that movie. Thank You for Smoking. I mean, it is so cynical and so brilliant and so beautiful. And when Aaron Eckhart all of a sudden looks at the cheese on the plate and the ice cream and all, and you just know what's coming. And
exactly.
It's just brilliant. And obviously,
Did we lose
Hey,
Bill?
have I lost my connection? All right. Am I back? Can you hear me now?
We can hear
Hold
you.
Hold on. Am I back or not? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, that was weird.
I can hear you, but
that's very strange, right? Okay, sorry about that.
Quite a bit of that.
No, I understand. So let me just shorten it. What are some of the other trade associations that you're working with?
Sure. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, as many of you know, along with the Wine Institute, Wine America, Beer Institute, and the Brewers Association, and the Cidery Association. So never before in the history of any legislation that deals with taxes, every segment of the industry come together to fight this. And it will continue to be a fight. But can any of you, can you imagine having your taxes increase 400%?
Yeah.
It's just
crazy.
Insane.
Yeah, no, it is insane. And running a business that has bad profit margins already, especially in this market and what we're doing with COVID. So let's talk a little bit about whiskey, okay?
Sure.
And assuming that there is money for innovation, what do you see coming with American whiskeys? Obviously, when people think American whiskey, they used to think bourbon, okay, or they would think Tennessee whiskey. The marketplace is so much more complex now, and it's fascinating that great American single malts. Well, what do you see coming down the pike in terms of innovation and in terms of what your members are telling you?
Sure. Since you mentioned American single malt, I will say that just as soon as we get this FET in permanency, we will definitely be working with, and perhaps even in conjunction if it's not made permanent, but with TTB to look at that standard of identity for American single malt, because I think it's probably long overdue that we get to that place so that the American product is recognized on that market. And going back to tariffs for a second, every minute that our product is delayed from reaching the other shelves, rest assured you're going to get product in from India, from Australia. And we all know how competitive shelf space is. So that's why this is incredibly important. But some of the other trends, you I'm sure have seen bottled and bond has become very, very in vogue. There's some really terrific things coming out of that. I think for many to be able to really identify those expressions and to be able to promote and tell the story, because the consumers right now, particularly even with the pandemic, they want to know about what they're buying, because there's less, I think, monies to spend on something that is more experimental. And in fact, one of the difficulties that I've had recently, and members say, but people don't understand what's going on. They see in the media that spirits are like flying off the shelves. That's true for comfort brands. That's absolutely true for brands that are already really well known. But that's why I was so delighted to see you pull off your shelf so many other bottles that maybe aren't quite so well known. Because if I can do anything, it will be to ask the consumer to please try and buy local, looking at what's on the label, looking at the story behind it, because for lots and lots of craft distillers, not only their heart and soul, but what's being put in the bottle is really, really good. But unless you can get the marketing behind it, and that's why we all love Benny's, right? And Brett, because he's willing to seek out and find those products that maybe aren't so well known, but to put them on the shelf and also help promote them.
I agree with you about Brett very much. Years ago, I learned something interesting about shelf space and how you treat your walk-in customer years ago from Brett. There was one year when Oban 14 there was a shortage of Oban 14. And it was a bottle that I loved, and I always had a bottle of it on my shelf. And I couldn't find, and I went online and it wasn't there, because I had heard from a friend of mine who was a bartender that Oban 14 was in a shortage. I emailed Brett and he said, we have it in the store. And I emailed him back and I said, but it's not on your website. And he said, right, because if I leave it on the website, all the big bars and restaurants are going to buy it and my walk-in customer can't get it. So it's interesting how the mind of the retailer wanted to keep something available for us who walk in.
Right.
And it was a wonderful lesson for me. With respect to, so we did mention both bottled and bond and American single malt. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about American single malt. Okay, that is, obviously it is something that is growing. We're seeing more and more of it. How do you see that growing in the international marketplace? Assuming that the tariffs are not an issue anymore. How do you see American distributors and producers competing with the traditional single malt brands that you see coming out of Scotland?
Yeah, so we have been focused primarily on what's going on Capitol Hill versus right now with standard of identity. So we have not done the outreach that we would like to do with our respective organizations across the pond. But I will tell you, if we are able to secure that standard of identity, which gives different marketing ability, actually throughout the world for that matter, I think that you will find our products highly, highly competitive.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. So I have a number of other questions that I can ask you, but I'd rather open it up to the crowd here to have other people ask you questions. And then, if we need to come back to my list of questions, we can do so. I think that Paul, I think you posted a question here in the chat room. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I kind of had a couple in the chat room.
Okay.
So first, I'm wondering specifically about tariffs' impact on sourcing for production, not necessarily our products overseas, but bringing in any kind of barrels from overseas or malted barley. I know a lot of people, if they're looking for peated malts, still go to the UK markets, etc. Is that a concern that is addressable, or is it too small to really impact our industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My own view is, even if it's small, anything that disallows our small businesses to manufacture product, it's big enough. That's why even I mentioned before, only 10% of our membership exports. It doesn't matter. We still care, and that's why we take the efforts to make sure that we are consistently putting pressure on. You know, I didn't mention Kentucky Distillers Association. We work in conjunction with them as well to make sure that the collective voice, because we all know that there is strength in numbers. So it's definitely an issue, and one that we'd be looking at more closely, but with the hope, with the real hope, that the negotiations will continue to such a point where that second round of tariffs will not be slapped on our product. And remember, it's not limited, likely not limited to whiskey, right? So we've got the other categories coming in as well.
And then there was like another question there, I guess, maybe even as a follow-up, but speaking of trade groups banding together, are there any industry or trade groups that are actually pro or pushing the tariffs that you're aware of, that you're, you know, arguing against, or is it primarily no part of any industry is really pushing this?
I am not aware of any of the trade groups within our circles that would be pushing that.
Yeah.
I think we all collectively agree it's just one of those things that we've been caught up as a pawn.
That's horrible. Eric, did you have any questions?
Yeah, so one question is, I mean, I guess, which would be a good thing, is how often do you have members that become too big to be part of the craft association?
Awesome question. So our membership definition allows you to produce up to 750,000 proof gallons. So 751 proof gallons before we would say you're no longer considered craft, or alternatively, that you're also 50% of the ownership, so 51 or more percent of the ownership is with a larger brand. So what does that mean? It means that we would ask you to remove yourself from the voting member class, but we would never want to discourage someone from remaining within our craft spirits family. So for instance, Smooth Ambler, West Virginia, right? They got bought up. They're now an alumni class member. So they no longer vote as a craft spirits person, but they're still within our family. And that's the same reaching out to Greenbrier, Copper and Kings, right? They just went over. So anyone who previously had been within our circle, but took that next step.
Got it.
Thanks.
Got it. You know, actually, I see a great question from, I want to go to Lynn and then go to Michael Bloom, but Lynn Schatz has a great question. Actually, Lynn, do you want to ask a question, or do you want me to read it? Okay. Okay. So I know that there was a GoFundMe for a distiller in Minneapolis, okay, who suffered a lot of damage due to the riots that were going on up there. Do you have any update for us for how that GoFundMe went and how he's doing? That got a lot of coverage.
I am so glad you asked that question, because Chris Montana, due north, was at the epicenter of the precinct where George Floyd was killed. And Chris's distillery took on an immense amount of damage, and actually the damage was caused from the water systems, which ran for 5 hours to put out fires. So he lost everything, his inventory. Now, fortunately, as he says, the day before, literally the day before, he had moved the bulk of his product to an offsite storage area, thinking, hey, things are not looking so good here. I know Chris really well, because Chris served as ACSA's president until literally 4 days before that incident occurred. We had just transferred from his presidency to the new president. So it was a Friday night, and I had CNN on, and I'm seeing this like in complete disbelief. And that's how the GoFundMe then happened over that weekend, because we knew that we needed somehow to help Chris in his time of need.
Absolutely.
We collected close to initially, I don't know whether any of you have ever done a GoFundMe before. I had not. It was all new. And I thought, okay, we're going to set that as 10,000. I thought, oh, that's way too much. We'll never get that. Well, we collected just shy of 100,000.
Wow.
Wow.
Which
That's
is amazing.
awesome. And how's he doing? So was he able to put that to use yet? Because it takes time to rebuild.
It does take time. And what Chris is, for those of you who don't know Chris, I would like to tell you he's one of the most remarkable people you can ever meet. Because you will not hear him, woe is me. What he did immediately is he cleaned out his distillery and realized that people in that precinct and actually downtown Minneapolis as a whole no longer had no way to get food, baby diapers, formula, medicine, bandages, basic human needs, toilet paper. He converted his distillery into a warehouse, pulling in all that stuff to serve his local community.
You have got to
He is still not open. Wait, I will give you an inside scoop on this as well. So Chris was in downtown Minneapolis. He moved into an apartment. While he was in the apartment with the distillery just being destroyed the day before, he had to evacuate the apartment he was in because they were trying to burn down his apartment building. Chris's wife actually had to navigate him, because Chris happens to be African American, navigate him away in the middle of the night from that apartment building using Google Maps so that he could avoid where there were protests and where they knew it would hot spots if he entered that. I spoke to Chris only 2 days ago.
Okay.
No, 3 days ago, and I'll tell you why. The ACSA Board of Directors had put as a part of its strategic plan, this was pre-pandemic, and this was certainly pre what's going on right now in the country, right? And part of that strategic plan was diversity and inclusion, where the concept was to run 2 people per year through an apprenticeship program at 3 to 4 distilleries in the country. And you would be looking at underserved and underrepresented people, because as Chris has said before, and the board absolutely agreed with, you can tell people, oh, come on in. But if you don't give people tools, how do they know how to come in? How do you kind of like break down that wall? It's one thing to say, we welcome you. It's another thing to give people the tools. So what happened just this past week is the first board met, and it's called the Step Up Foundation, and it's spirit training, entrepreneurship program for the underrepresented professionals. And we are launching a 501c3, so we can take donations and grants and larger donations to run at least initially 2 people, and we have a full-fledged program that we want to be build out in legacy. And for that very reason, I think Chris's motivation was right even before this happened. And even now, we all feel so strongly that we have to try and make things right.
Sure. No, that's great. So with respect to his distillery and when he'll be producing again, when do we think that'll be happening? He's still close.
He said to me, Margie, it's still pretty raw. That happened in May, right? So yeah. it will be forthcoming. And ironically, I just talked to him. He makes a wonderful spirit called Cafe Frida. I don't know whether you've had it before. It's a coffee-flavored liqueur, which is just phenomenal. And I said, Chris, I need a bottle. And he said, don't worry, I've got a warehouse full. Well, not so much anymore. That was all lost.
Oh, that hurts to hear. Michael Bloom, Mr. 50 State Blind, what question do you have for Margie?
Unmuted. So actually, I have a question about your website, Margie. I was able, right before this meeting started, to look it up and notice that your membership section highlights your alumni, what you mentioned, and highlights the founders. But I was really interested in the full membership. Is that something that one can see if you're not a member?
No, and actually, even if you are a member, you cannot see it.
Oh, okay.
Let me tell you what.
The best shorthand I found was to find the awards from 2020 and 2019 to see the kind of distilleries of whiskey that are part of that family. That's the best.
Gotcha.
But I love.
Gotcha. You know, we purposely did that, and I will tell you why. What we found is that some outside entities that you don't want necessarily going to your membership were pulling that membership list down and contacting them. So we did it as a safety measure.
Okay, so that makes total sense. I was just curious because a lot of what I'm really interested in is finding those little teeny whiskey distillers in this country and figuring out how, once you find something, to really be able to share the news that that's worth trying. And they don't necessarily have enough distribution to even make it into the awards that would show up on a site like yours. So I'm wondering what is it, or what channels do you use as an organization to get the word out about small distilleries like that?
Well, we have several different communications vehicles right now. Are you all familiar with Craft Spirits magazine?
I've seen it.
Okay, so that was an initiative that was launched last year. And while it is somewhat trade related, it goes much broader than that. And the intent there is to make sure that there's a professionally well done magazine that actually comes from a trade but speaks across the different sort of boundaries. Besides that, we use Craft Spirits Live, we use Craft Spirits TV, and we also try and do interviews with our members throughout the year. We also have something called, and this is a membership benefit, but it's called Craft Spirits Weekly. So we are promoting every week the smaller craft distilleries and making sure people know. The other thing I should mention too is we're always looking for opportunities to bring our members into events, when we used to have events, that they otherwise would not have gotten to because of price points, where we'll pick up, like, for instance, Bar Convent Brooklyn, and we just participated in Global Bar Week. So we brought in several of our smaller distillers to sit on our quote bar under our umbrella.
Right. Oh, that's smart. By the way, are there membership levels, for instance, for individuals? Like, let's say that I wanted to join,
Yes.
you're as like a supporter or something like that.
Yes.
What would that involve?
You would come under the affiliate membership, but because you're you as opposed to sort of a corporate, there's an individual membership.
And how much is that, if you happen to know how much that is?
Sure, it's $250 for the year.
Interesting. All right. That's
and then
reasonable.
you have access to all the membership stuff at that point.
Yeah, got it. Interesting. What other questions do we have from the crowd? I have a few others that I can ask, but one. Todd, go.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about your own origin story into craft spirits. How did you get into enjoying them, and then how did you decide that you wanted to become part of the association?
Sure. So I'm Slovak by way of heritage, so I grew up with slivovitz. And it was like no big deal to have slivovitz on the table. And when I would go to Praha and visit relatives, or Kuti, Slovakia, Bratislava, it would not be unusual, even as a kid, right, to have a drink. So I never thought about the fact that, you can't drink? Why not, if you're doing it responsibly? Because there is that thing. But in any event, so I am a lawyer, actually, by way of education and training. I practiced employment law in DC, and then I went over to the association side. I worked for another association here in DC, actually of trial lawyers, for 16 years. So I had a lot of association management background. Well, without boring you with the long details, I'd never been a stay-at-home mom, and I'm a feminist at heart. And I realized when my daughter, one was going into 10th grade and the other was going into 7th, if I didn't do it then, would I look back for myself and say, hey, where were you in this? And I've always kind of set out to do what is right for me to do. So I talked to my husband and I left my paid employ. I don't think I ever worked as hard as when I was a stay-at-home, non-paid mother and wife. And even then, I remember going to my first doctor's appointments and I no longer had a title. And I thought, this is so weird. So I began writing down CEO of the household. And every doctor I saw, hey, can I tell my wife this? like, yeah, go ahead, because, you know, we work hard, right? In any event, the agreement I had with my husband was when our youngest was going off to college, I would go back into the paid workforce. Well, I was having a really good time, and like I kind of forgot what I agreed to. And he said to me the week before she went to school, okay, what are you going to do? I'm like, about what? And he said, remember the agreement? I'm like, oh, dang. Yes. And he said, I have an offer for you. Well, he's a lawyer, and he actually has a law firm, Lehrman Beverage Law, that does only beer, wine, and spirits law. And he said, would you like to come into my firm as a lawyer? And I said, I don't know anything about alcohol law. And he said, you'll learn it. I worked for him for 3 years. I was actually at the second ACSA convention in Austin, Texas. That's where I met Paul Letko for the first time. And they announced that their executive director was retiring, and there was a search committee, and they were looking for a new director. And my husband jumps up and he said, that job was meant for you. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm now like practicing with you. But ultimately, it was like the best decision ever, because I don't know whether any of you have ever done anything with your spouse like day in and day out. This is a better fit for me. So anyway, I loved it because I do love the association community. I love members. I have never worked with a more talented, smart, passionate group of small business entrepreneurs. I feel so humbled by the people I work with daily. They're super smart and super motivated to manufacture for you something that they think that you'll really enjoy. And we run the gamut from, you mentioned Blom Brothers, right? So Mike used to be with the government, kind of like with computers, spy kind of stuff, right? Go from that to Tom Mooney, who was with Procter & Gamble, brought Fiji over to this country and made it wildly popular. So like we run the gamut from people that also are just super passionate about it, and they put the money together and somehow get the funding to open up this distillery. And I always say that distilleries are like the grown-up version of breweries because it takes so much more work and effort to make a really quality spirit versus a beer that you can make that much more quickly. And if it doesn't work, you kind of just toss it. You can toss spirits, and our distillers do, but there's a lot more effort. And even I was talking to someone today about barrel selection, you know, how incredibly important that is for whiskey. Think of the whiskeys that you've had where you can just sense where that came from and how much more pleasurable it is. So that's a very long explanation of how I got to where I am. And 5 years later, here I am still. So it's, I guess it's worked out okay.
Oh, that's wonderful. Todd, that was a great question, and it's funny you mentioned that thing about barrel selection, because we've asked that question frequently of the people with whom whom we've interviewed, and also a few weeks ago, Michael Bloom, Eric Leader, and Paul Barrington and I, we were all at Dave Sweet's competition, where we were judges, at the Consumer's Choice competition for Whiskey and Barrel Night. And you're right. You can frequently tell when you're tasting something what's going on with that barrel. And even Monique Houston from
of course.
Okay, Monique. Everybody knows Monique, right? She's amazing from Winebow. She told us that when she's tasting something, she can almost immediately tell what size barrel it came from.
That's
it's just
good.
because, right?
That's really good.
Oh no, Monique is at a different level. It's like, we bow, to Monique and her knowledge. We're not worthy, but really, she's amazing. The things that she would tell us about that kind of stuff, and it's fascinating. I got to tell you, Todd's question kicked ass, because that just really showed us your passion for what you do. So I really have no other questions right now, just because of how wonderful that last question was, and the opportunity it gave you to talk about what you do and why you love it. Is there anything that you would like to sum up with for us to tell us about, your mission, what you're working on, anything in particular that you as an organization want to make sure that we hear before we sum it up here?
Sure. There's one point that we have not mentioned that will be critically important to your ability in the future, regardless of where you are. to continue to enjoy the spirits of your choice. And that is an area that we saw during this pandemic has been somewhat changed because of the inability to get close to each other in part, and also to keep businesses alive. And what I'm talking about specifically is direct-to-consumer shipping. You're probably aware that in the wine world, 48 states allow direct-to-consumer shipping. Spirits have traditionally always been treated differently than beer, and have been treated different than wine. And that's also part why it was so necessary to have a trade group that represents spirits, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? It couldn't be more true. And that's why we've begun discussions with the wholesalers. I had a great call with them last week. It's all very preliminary, but what I do want to say is, if you looked at a state like Oregon, which happens to be a control state, and a state like Virginia, which is a control state, both of those states now allow direct-to-consumer shipping. And what they found is that their state stores have not suffered because of that. And so one of our primary goals will be, and remember the 21st Amendment means it's state controlled versus federal. So at least on the federal excise tax, I can kind of make a difference there. With direct-to-consumer shipping though, because it is state controlled, I still believe ACSA has a major role, because we can help give the messaging, the talking points, the wisdom, which is just common sense. If you don't want people going into like stores and congregate because they want to spend the time looking, let them do it online. It should be about consumer choice, right? And beyond that as well, with tasting rooms closing, give these businesses a lifeline. Like tasting room, for craft distillers, this is an important point, 44% of their overall sales comes from their tasting room. If you cut off 44% right off the top, what happens? And if your product, going back to comfort brand, well-known, so they don't rely on it like craft spirits producers do.
Wow, that's huge. That's an amazing percentage. You know, it's
a massive amount.
No, it's massive. I think it was Debbie Samuels last time when Debbie heard that we were going to be interviewing you this time and that you're not a representative of a particular distillery. I think it was Debbie who said, "Well, what do I buy this week?" You know, because we always try. It's funny in our own little way.
Right.
We all try to support
yes
the people who are giving their time to us for us to have fun during this hellacious period of our lives.
Exactly.
And Debbie, you really nailed it on the head with that question, because it's absolutely perfect, and every time that I line somebody up, I'm always thinking, okay, good. I want to buy some of that stuff. Okay. What, it helps for the shelves. And what I'd like to do right now, because that also was a great question. And I want to remind you also, and I'll email you after this, if there's any particular, legislation, regulation that you want us to get the word out a bit, please be in contact with us. Please send it to us. Eric and I will do our best to get the word out. What I'd like everybody to do right now, I see Paul raising his hand again. Paul, is that another question?
Yeah, actually, to build on that, I know that, maybe we can in particular get something on that in terms of consumer outreach to help with getting the word out. But do you actually have like a distribution list or something for consumers that we can tell our friends to sign up for?
So Paul, stay tuned on that. We will be developing a more
consumer-facing outreach
thoughtful, plan, so that when we do it, because this has to be very carefully worked, right? We don't want anyone to believe in even 1 second that we're trying to get rid of the 3-tier system, because we are not. But we're trying to have a system in the 21st century that makes sense for the 21st century. So while we're not saying tear apart the 21st Amendment, we are saying let's modernize and let's make it make sense. So I will absolutely be back in touch. Actually, I got off a call just an hour ago about potential slogans that we are focus grouping. So stay tuned. We're almost there, ready to release it.
You know, it's funny. Paul Sweet is already using us. Paul Sweet already asks us questions. You know, he sends emails to some of us. You know, he's in touch with us. So feel free to use us as well. And again, we have a pretty small group tonight, but it's we have a lot of people on our lists. You know, so please feel free. What I'd like everybody to do right now, everybody, please unmute yourselves. Please make sure that if you are so inclined to have something in your glass, and join me in saying cheers and thank you to Margie.
Cheers.
Cheers and
Cheers.
thank you, Margie.
Votre
Yes.
santé.
Yes.
Cheers and thank you.
Margie, this was great. I really didn't know what to expect because, you know, this is different for us. I mean, we've had people who are not producers. We've had Lou Bryson, okay, who's just a wonderful personality. We've had,
Yes.
you know, Marty Duffy, who's, you know, Glencairn Glassnell, but everybody
Yes.
knows Marty. You know, but, you know, for the most part, we've been having people who themselves are producers or retailers. And you gave us a different perspective tonight. And I really appreciate that. I thought that was wonderful. So again, thank you very much.
You're welcome. My
yeah.
pleasure. It was so good
the
seeing you
different
all.
perspective.
What was that,
Good,
Lynn?
Lynn.
I loved the different perspective.
Yeah, no, it was great. So what I'd like us to do right now, Eric, if you can turn off the recording and let us know when the recording's off.